I know that this UDO is going to has even taken on a high degree of importance, especially now with all the conversations surrounding the comprehensive plan. So I really appreciate you all being able to make connections between the two. I'm very sure that at the end of the day, we get to a good place with the plan, get to a good place with the mapping, and all your work, you will see that it's being reflected in exactly the way we want to see this city really grow and develop over the next 2 decades. So once again, I want to thank you for the detailed work that you're doing, for the extra time you're putting into this, reading the materials and not just listening to our presentation and engagement on Thursdays, but also really taking time on your own to do all that. So thank you very much for staying engaged. So I'll turn it over to Tony. I will have to jump off for a noon call, but I may stay on if that call isn't happening. But really appreciate all of you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you again for your continued efforts and your continued engagement on this. And often, you see efforts like this rise in profile and rise in importance as time goes by and we get closer to the point where it's formally considered and adopted. And I think that's starting to happen here. And that's an okay thing. And I've beat the drum all along about this process that we have and this engagement that we have that is inclusive, that is transparent, and is very rigorous. And by having that in place, when things start to heat up, that gives us a good bedrock, a good framework to continue to do the work that we've been doing all along and stick with it. And, with the same level of rigor and transparency, inclusiveness that we've had all along. So I really want to commend everyone, and especially the staff, for helping to craft and maintain this process as we go along. And I think it's a model for communities everywhere, for cities and towns everywhere, for folks who are doing this kind of work. And I think we should be really proud of it. So thank you all for what you're doing. So Laura and Alan, kick it off.
Thanks, Tony. As usual, we'll be recording today's meeting, and we'll upload a video recording to our YouTube playlist on the Planning Department's YouTube channel. And we're again live streaming, and I think we're probably going to make that work this time. So we've tried to do that for the last couple of meetings and have run into some technical problems, but I think we're good to go on that today. You've all are aware of our usual procedure on that. And just as a reminder, we've got a presentation that will be narrated by staff today. There will be a couple of stops along the way that we can stop and discuss the material and answer questions you may have at that time. But in the meantime, as we go along, if questions come to mind, please use the chat feature in Zoom to enter your questions. We'll try to keep up with them as best we can live, but chances are we may have to go back and revisit some of the chat and make sure we've answered questions and addressed comments as they've come in. And then obviously at the end, we'll stop and we'll go back and spend as much time as we need to deal with the questions and comments that have come in during the course of the presentation. So at this point, I believe I am handing off to Jordan Miller from our stormwater section. Today's topics, we've got a couple of topics to cover today. We're going to be talking about post-construction stormwater regulations and also stormwater drainage regulations. So Jordan, I think this is where I hand off to you.
Thanks, Alan. Appreciate it. So a lot of these first few slides will be the same slides that some of y'all or all of y'all would have seen 2 weeks ago when we begun the stormwater discussions. So this is just a lead-in slide to just sort of remind everyone that we have many, many streams and tributaries within our watershed. We are rest on a ridge. So we are the headwaters of a lot of streams, meaning we are where a lot of the streams begin and lead into both the Yadkin and Catawba river basins. This is a map of Mecklenburg County, and this is just a reminder that stormwater services responsibility is to protect and improve the city's surface waters. We have reasons to do that outside of being good stewards of the environment and in regards to federal, state, and local laws and policies. And then one of the main goals of stormwater services is to manage the city's phase 1 municipal separate stormwater system permit, which is a federal requirement and is implemented by the state of North Carolina. One important thing to note on this map, and apologize, I know most of y'all have probably heard this a couple weeks ago, but all those red lines indicate streams that are impaired for at least one pollutant or otherwise do not meet designated uses for the stream. And so you can see that pretty much anywhere in the county that you may live, you drain to an impaired stream. A lot of the smaller tributaries that are shown in blue are not necessarily unimpaired, but rather not monitored for the same parameters for those reasons. Next slide, thanks. And this is just a reminder, as Taiwo mentioned in the beginning, about the connection between the comp plan and the UDO and this implementation arm of those goals and policies that will be set in the eventual comp plan. And then you can see on the right all the different ordinances that are being pulled into the UDO. Today we're going to talk about an existing ordinance, the post-construction stormwater ordinance, which is in chapter 18 of City Code, as well as Kate will be discussing some drainage article sections. And one of those will be pulling some information out of the subdivision chapter about flood state requirements. So again, trying to compile this into a more uniform section. Again, this is a repeat slide, but just a reminder of some of the existing draft policies and objectives and goals within the draft comprehensive plan that relate specifically to the environment and stormwater. And so this is not meant to read through this, but just as a something to keep in mind as you're thinking about what the city's goals are. So an overview of the stormwater chapter thus far, we've already hit the first 4 that you see there. The 2 that we're going to discuss today, to reiterate, are post-construction stormwater and as well as drainage regulations. For post-construction, it's mostly dealing with regulating runoff and pollutant loading, leaving sites after development. Last time Jay Wilson talked about regulating those types of things during development when a site is under construction. So this will be the post-development impact on the downstream system. And then Kate will be talking about more drainage related regulations as it relates to individual sites and how they might impact the drainage system. This is obviously the lead-in slide to the post-construction stormwater regulations. We can go to the next slide. So this is the outline. This is almost identical to the current outline of the ordinance. A lot of this will be informational before we get into some potential changes, just because I know a lot of the folks on the call, if you don't work with this every day, you probably have no idea what it is. So we want to kind of talk about what the current ordinance requires. And so we have a purpose and applicability section, some deed recordation requirements, and then it gets into sort of the meat of the standards and stormwater management requirements, as well as some logistics of how you obtain a permit and go through that, and then on to the some mitigation options that have been built into the ordinance for 13 years, as well as the maintenance and long-term stewardship. As you can see to the left, a lot of the requirements in this section, as you will see here in the next few slides, result in physical assets being built on property. And so those obviously need to be maintained just like anything else. And so talking about maintenance and long-term stewardship of those assets. Then obviously, as with most ordinances, there's an appeal and variance process, and then violation and enforcement type proceedings that are included in the article. So again, to reiterate the overview, so this ordinance is a requirement of the city's NPDES permit, which is spelled out there. And we are required to have an ordinance to regulate post-construction runoff. And so this is the mechanism legally that we use to satisfy that condition of the permit. The state of North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality issues our permit. They review our ordinance as one of the 9 requirements of that permit, and they make sure that it meets the state's minimum standards. And sometimes the state does have something that would be a maximum as well, which will come up later in this talk. And an overview. So this has been the stated purpose of the ordinance since its original adoption in 2008. And it's to protect and maintain and enhance public health, safety, and environment by minimizing impacts of stormwater runoff and what we call non-point source pollution. So not someone dumping something into the creek or a leaky pipe like an oil spill. It's something that is a non-point source. So it's something that isn't easily attainable from where it may have derived from. So much of that is stormwater runoff. And so we want to improve our surface water quality by regulating that runoff and minimize damage to downstream property infrastructure. So that's one big thing. And then a term that I want to point out because it'll come up several times, and I know folks on the call may not be familiar with it, is the term built upon area, which essentially is impervious or partially impervious materials. You can think of gravel, concrete, rooftops, sidewalks, asphalt, pavement, anything that would basically restrict the soil's ability to infiltrate stormwater or rain water directly into the ground. So you can think about those types of materials when we mention built upon area or BUA. I will probably say BUA because it's a habit, so apologies in advance. So the 4 main requirements of the current ordinance, we'll just kind of roll through these real quick. Those of you that were on the call 2 weeks ago heard a little bit about what we call swim buffers. It's very similar. So the post-construction ordinance requires stream buffers. They tend to be required on more streams because they go further up into the watershed uphill, if you can think of it that way, on smaller tributaries. And they range anywhere from 30 feet to 200 feet. The reasons why we regulate stream buffers are listed there, but they are to protect habitat for wildlife. They're to keep temperature control within the stream, which also helps with habitat, to filter out pollutants as rainwater, stormwater runoff comes through that that buffer, and as well as some of the other things listed here. And they range so greatly because what we've done with this ordinance previously is accommodated development within 3 main watershed districts: the Central Catawba, where we have more already impaired, more urban environment; the Yadkin, which is on the east side of the county and the city, where it's more of a greenfield development, and there's actually an endangered species habitat present that we needed to address. And then the Western Catawba, where it drains to our drinking water supply, which we also talked about 2 weeks ago. So different levels of protection, and that's why there's such a wide range of buffers, because the buffers would vary depending on the level of protection that was the goal some 13 years ago. And then forested natural area is a term that is similar to other sort of open space requirements that the city might have in other articles. But the main goal was to preserve some area of the site to have a treed area of environment that would be protected. And the amount of area that would be required would depend on the level of development that was to occur on that site. And this would apply to all development. The one thing to point out here, I took this sort of Google Street View image so as not to relay that all of these areas end up being the forest that's shown on the right. This can be provided in planting strips or easements and right-of-ways where it may be restricted to plant, a true, forest type environment, but you may be able to get some lower maturing type trees, small maturing trees, and other types of vegetation that can still provide some of the similar benefit. And then this is the biggest meat of this ordinance, which is what we call stormwater management. And so you see the image up in the upper right. So that is what can happen from unregulated stormwater runoff, increased stormwater runoff. as built upon area, or BUA, is placed on a site and removes the site's initial ability to just hold that water on site. So it pushed off quicker, faster, and more volume of it, since it can't infiltrate into the soil. So you end up with insides banks with erosion, and then you see the silt or sedimentation happening within the channel, which removes habitat. And so that's what leads to these impaired streams, or one of the reasons that these impaired streams can occur. And so several of the ways and tools that we have to arrest this problem is, you can see the 3 images on the bottom, and those are what's called stormwater control measures, previously referred to as best management practices, or BMPs, for folks on the call that may have been in this world for a while. You can see one's a wet pond on the left. It holds a permanent pool of water. And then you have another one in the middle that has a sand media, where you can see the lighter color stone. And that basically works like you might have a pool filter on your pool. It allows the water to go through sand, and it removes some of the pollutants, and also slows it down, and basically trickles out to the downstream property instead of a mad rush. And then the one in the on the right there is a bioretention or rain garden, which works similar to a sand filter. It's just generally smaller and shallower. So the points 3 and 4 are both managed through these types of practices. Stormwater detention is essentially taking that big rush of water and trying to mimic the pre-development drainage pattern as it relates to the peak amount of flow that would be coming off of that site at any point. And so that is done through essentially building a big hole in the ground to hold that water and slowly release it. The second part there is pollutant removal, which we have 2 main pollutants of concern. I won't delve into this, but essentially it's around sediment and phosphorus. And we want to remove those pollutants through settling, filtration, or infiltration are the main mechanisms by which those can be removed. And those, again, are managed through these types of stormwater control measures. Originally, these types of requirements applied to development and redevelopment. So if a site, you can envision much of the development that's happening in Charlotte now, downtown, or in an urban environment where you're tearing down one building and rebuilding another. Previously, all these things were required on those types of development, but are no longer on private property. So that's the reason for the bold there. It's now just applies to development itself. I think I beat that. Thanks. And then some potential key changes. So that was just mostly an overview of what this ordinance is meant to do and what the current requirements are. So the easy ones are on this slide, which we're moving from Chapter 18 into the UDO and the Stormwater and Natural Resources section. That's an easy one. Some removal of some older exemptions. This has been fairly consistent through at least all of the stormwater articles we've been working on. Just looking at, what's either out of date, isn't even relevant anymore, or what's never used, what's confusing. How can we, sort of combine some of these to make it more user friendly, and, just remove unnecessary verbiage. And then the last one is on this slide is the cleanup of language and definitions throughout, which, again, most of these are pretty benign, mostly trying to make things consistent through such that we can through different sections and articles. So here's the ones that are more specific to post-construction that would be in the potential UDO proposal. And so right now we have and I'll touch on this one in more detail, because I know some folks on the call this will trigger. Pun intended. Applicability triggers right now are dependent on your type of development. So are you a residential or a commercial? Those are defined specifically in the ordinance that may be different from if folks are familiar with zoning rules, but essentially single family residential versus everything else. So they may have different triggers that may not be totally equitable if you took the same site and developed it in 2 different manners. And in the new UDO proposal, we would be potentially lowering that trigger and making it consistent across all use types, instead of having, one type of development have a totally different trigger than another. Again, I'll touch on this in more detail. And then redevelopment, this is due to a change in state law from 2018. We are required by that law to change our ordinance of to meet the removal of the redevelopment requirements. And we haven't done so because we've just been in practice and policy not enforcing that section of the ordinance, and because we were working on the UDO, so it didn't make sense open up the ordinance and change it twice. So this is mostly a cleanup to align with the state law that was passed in late 2018. And then the third one on this slide here is the preservation or revegetation of natural area, which was item number 2 on the previous slides. And really the goal here is to move the same protections, not necessarily the same requirements, but the same protections over to the tree article of the UDO, where there is generally some more overlapping or requirements between the two. And so we can get them all in one spot. And hopefully we'll make the things a little more user-friendly. And then currently, this is a little bit down in the weeds, but currently you have some mitigation options. And when I say that, that means instead of doing maybe all 4 of those things that we mentioned on the previous slides, maybe you do, and this is not technically accurate, but maybe you do 3 out of the 4. Basically, you would do less on your site if you're in a specific geographic location that was intended to incentivize density and redevelopment. Those are along the transit corridors, the light rail, so along the Blue Line and Blue Line extension and potential future light rail alignments. So again, you want to have near the transit stations, you want to have this dense environment. And so we wanted to allow for folks to do that and promote that to happen. And so we allowed for some differences in what the requirements might be as opposed to a site, on a greenfield site where it's basically a blank slate. And so in the proposed UDO, we would look to either remove some of those incentives since they were specific to redevelopment, we can no longer regulate that, or permanently establish the geography because it's been tied to a little bit of a moving target. The geography has changed over time. And so we're looking to either remove some of those incentives because they may not be as useful anymore, or permanently establish the geography so it doesn't change over time unnecessarily anyways. And then also previously there was some reductions in requirements for industrially zoned development. And so we're looking at whether those mitigation or those reduced requirements need to remain in the ordinance and the UDO moving forward. And a lot of that has to do with the change in going from sort of what a lot of folks may be used to with our typical I1, I2 type zoning to more of the place type framework, and how that may impact the environment if we have, a change in the amount of sites that would be eligible for this, and whether that still makes sense. Because again, most of this stuff was developed between 2005 and 2007. So just looking back at that. And then another big one that some of the folks on the call will recognize, we have current requirements for detention, which again is creating a vessel basically to store this water and slowly release it. We have that on the books going back to 1978, and that's been in our zoning ordinance since 1978. And so it's always been somewhat of that's still there, and it still may apply even if you're exempt from a lot of these more comprehensive requirements in this section of city code. And so the goal is to remove that section of the zoning ordinance and just rely on a potentially lower threshold to catch what we may have caught with those, and not have sort of these oftentimes overlapping requirements. Have them all in one place and not have to go 2 places. Next slide. So this is a comparison, because the next slide is going to talk about the potential lower threshold. So this is a comparison of some North Carolina municipalities and then some other municipalities in the region and what their thresholds generally as it relates to built upon area. Again, that's what BUA is. Some of these do use a disturbance threshold, as you can see kind of towards the bottom there, it's underlined. But again, just to sort of show how we might match up to other municipalities in the stormwater regulatory realm. So here, we currently have 20,000 square feet is the threshold for non-single family type development. So 20,000 square feet of built upon area placed on a site after 2008, you have to comply with this ordinance. What that means by compliance varies on a bunch of different things, but essentially that's the trigger to get you in the door. And then for single family, it's different, as I mentioned currently. So it's 24%, which can obviously vary depending on if you have a large site or a small site, and that's for single family specifically. So you can see how that may match up on some of these other cities that have similar ordinances. So the current, again, is 20,000 or 24%. And the potential proposed draft here is to make everything consistent at 5,000. So, or there is also a current trigger of 1 acre of disturbance, and that would remain. So really it's just changing the built upon area trigger. And the goal is to make that more equitable across, one site developed next to another one for different types of uses could have, could have 19,000 square foot of built upon area, and the single family may be only allowed 3,000 because of the site size and the triggers. So this is to more equitably require those compliance measures on site. And some of the reasoning behind that was based on the average lot size of a single family use lot within this city as of now. And the average 24% of the average lot is approximately 5,000 on average. So that was another reasoning. And looking at potentially lowering that, again, helps us to potentially get rid of or remove the detention requirements within the zoning ordinance, so we don't have these potentially overlapping requirements. And then existing exemptions for small previously recorded lots that have been in the ordinance since 2008, all that's going to remain in there. So we're not removing any sort of the grandfathering of old lots that some folks may be familiar with, mostly relating to single family or small multifamily sites. Those will remain in there. And so this is just a snapshot. So you see the change. It's the same chart as you saw before, but with the proposed 5,000, how that might stack up with some comparable municipalities. And that is all of the information I have. I know I saw some questions. Andrew, I don't know if Andrew or Alan, you want to handle that, but
yeah, I'll moderate. Thanks, Jordan. Great job. The first question we had in was from Eric Zaverl. The question was, are there any more urban solutions to stormwater detention, rainwater controls? And he sent a couple of examples. Kind of, the pictures that I saw were kind of green infrastructure. So, cutouts into sidewalks with areas that retain stormwater. You can explore some of those, but any thoughts or comments on that about urban solutions to stormwater detention?
Yes, and very familiar with Seattle, Portland, DC. Those are some of the big ones in the country that have some of these more, what folks may refer to as more green infrastructure type stormwater control measures, and those are allowed. Generally speaking, those are either bioswales or bioretention, which we do have standards and design guidelines for, and folks can choose to use those. I will say that some differences here are that generally they need to be outside of the public right of way. So a lot of these types of things that were linked may have been installed by the city or municipality or stormwater utility, although they're generally a combined sewer system. And so the right of way, so the image that's provided in a lot of these are probably in the right of way. And so that may be something that would be different here in the city of Charlotte, whereas a development may need to handle that outside of the right of way. Although the city will most likely be building some of these in the future to capture and treat and detain our own runoff. But yes, I would say these are options. They're generally smaller scales. It's more of like a low impact development type model. We do not regulate that. Specifically, we say that you have to meet these standards, and we don't specifically say it has to be done through a low impact development type format where you have maybe a bunch of different assets versus one regional asset. But I think the short answer is yes, something similar to this is allowable. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks. The second question was from Teresa McDonald. The question was, or the comment maybe, was that I hope the exception for redevelopment would not apply if problems exist or will be created. And I think the exception for redevelopment she's talking about is the change to state law, right? If you're not changing the built upon area, you're exempt or whatever. So any reaction to that?
Right. It's mostly a blind exemption, Teresa. So essentially, the state law changed to not allow municipalities or the state to require increased stormwater controls on redeveloped built upon areas. So if you take a site down, it has an acre of built upon area today, you put back an acre, then we, the state, no municipality can require you to put in any more stormwater controls that existed prior. So if they may have had some stormwater controls, they have to put those back, but you can't require any more, which is what our ordinance did for, basically 10 years. So that was a big change, but no, there is no, at least built-in mechanism for a municipality to require something based on an existing problem or issue or something to that effect.
Thanks. Scrolling down, a comment from Nate: changes of applicability and triggers and exemptions should be coordinated with other ordinances. You mentioned the tree ordinance subdivision, chapter 19. Mentioned sort of how difficult it is to manage all the different triggers and the different ordinances, and that everything should be related to place types, which I think you mentioned we would be shifting to. So any thoughts on that, on aligning with other ordinances for this? Is there a reason we picked the number we did? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I've said this, I don't know how many meetings, but
Yeah.
if we go through this whole thing and the tree ordinance has a different trigger in chapter, I don't know why we're doing this if we don't have the same applicability in triggers.
Hey, can I jump in on this, Andrew, and maybe ask also, I think Arista's on to help. We are working on aligning more, and I certainly know, Nate, that you've been talking about this, but what makes sense to trigger something related to the installation of a sidewalk, for example, or relocation of a sidewalk, or a certain planning stand or zoning standard may be overly burdensome, or vice versa, to trigger something with respect to stormwater. So where we can align them, we're working on doing that. But some standards are triggered at a very low level of activity on a site. And I don't think we want to do, and I'm guessing that you guys wouldn't want us to do that across the board.
I guess my question would be, it's again, maybe it's the way it's being presented. There should be an overarching discussion about triggers for ordinances. And then you should be going through the ordinances and figuring out where that doesn't fit in the right box for each one. And there's some nuances. And the way we're seeing it is, here's how each department thinks a trigger should work. And then we're going to go back and figure out how to align those. And so it's just so much, honestly, it's so much work on staff and the design and development community side on these projects that our goal is, again, to unify the ordinances. Maybe it's coming at the back end and I'm just not seeing it.
Well, and I'll say one of the, do we always want the same trigger? And my gut is we don't always want the same trigger. But how can we make those clearer and align them where we can?
Yeah.
As opposed to, some of these ordinances, we're really trying to take a relatively light touch, and you guys may not want us to have more, trying to think of the right word.
No,
lower triggers.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. It's just like, why am I counting how many windows are replaced for the tree ordinance? And then I'm counting how much impervious is changed for the stormwater ordinance. They don't even
Yeah.
at least use the same types of elements that trigger the ordinances.
And the same terminology and consistent terminology throughout. Yeah, we've certainly heard that, and I think you even will see when we get to the tree ordinance, maybe some adjustment to counting windows.
Yeah, and I'd say we're getting there. And some of this may just be the nature of the way we're presenting it. You know, we're really trying to go through each article, and maybe on the back end there's something we can do to present these things in an overarching way to get more constructive comments and feedback. So that totally, we hear you on that.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say where I'm coming from, the types of projects that get burdened by this are the ones that everybody wants to see. It's the minor renovation to some business that's been there for 30 years, that's redeveloping and wants to add a few parking spaces and do a facelift to their building. It's not some big new apartment project that we're talking about. And the smallest projects are the ones that are the most complicated with the way everything's written right now. So I hope we can, because I think that's what the community wants to save. I think that's what everyone sees as part of the goals. And so those shouldn't be the most difficult to figure out.
No, thanks for that. That's a good point. And we definitely hear that.
Yeah, and I'm going to say, I think we'll look at it across the board. But then and I think Nate, you've been really good about saying it's really kind of hard to look at these in pieces. It may seem a little bit siloed, and we've got to make sure that it's not, but I think then we're going to look for feedback on that. Like, okay, give us these examples. I think we're not going to say we're going to put out a draft and this is it. That's a starting point, not an ending point.
Thank you.
I think the next question is also Nate's, but I think there's some other support for the question. But the question is, why are we getting away from 24% low density requirements for single family? Also think it's very difficult to design a small BMP for a 5,000 square foot increase. And we will look forward to comments offline. But Jordan, any idea or comments on that?
I just appreciate Nate for not letting me down and having many more comments offline. So I appreciate that in advance. So yeah, I mean, really, honestly, a lot of the sites that would be the ones that be very difficult to design for, likely may trigger the ordinance today. And that was one of the reasons for the 5,000 is that if you take that 24% of your average lot size, you're already going to trigger it. So from a trigger perspective, it's not totally different. I won't go into implementation side of things yet, but to your point about, difficult to design, a small SCM for that. Yeah, I totally get that. And we are actively actually updating the stormwater BMP manual right now. So a lot of this has kind of been, let's figure out the thresholds, and then let's figure out if there's any changes to maybe what the requirements might be, because that is something that's not lost on any staff that's been working on this, is that, what kinds of compliance measures can be utilized, and let's make sure that it makes sense. So you're not designing, way over designing, say a sand filter for a single family home individually. So I don't have a good answer for you, Nate.
No, that makes sense. Honestly, that all makes sense. Thank you.
And there's a comment from John Morris. I don't think we got the full question, John. If you wanted to jump in and add to anything that Jordan just said, I think the last thing I see in the chat are the points, and it looks like the beginning of a question that wasn't finished.
Yeah, thank you. This is John Morris, and just following on Nate's comments. When we first started this whole process back in 2016, I think we spent the first year and a half creating a matrix which identified the conflicts between the tree ordinance, the post-construction control ordinance, the streets and section 19, the formerly urban street design guidelines. Have those comments, is that still a living document that y'all are looking at and incorporating as we do all the things that Nate on a more technical level understands, and y'all obviously understand better, but we spend a lot of time on that, and I just wanted to make sure that it was part of the process you're using as we seek to streamline this, and it gets to the point that you want to unify all those ordinances that were created in 2009 and 8 and 9 and 10 and eliminate the conflicts so that you can build.
So I'll jump in on this one. Certainly familiar with that. I think the intent, that the thought was that that had been accomplished at that point in time. I know that maybe not everyone agrees with that. John, if you have that and can shoot it over, we'd be glad to kind of do a gut test against that. But it's,
Hopefully, Nate, I mean, that was part of our process.
That was when we
Hopefully-
kicked off the committee, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure I could go back to some old meeting minutes and
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the public process. I would hope that that would be available, and it would be great if we could pick it back up because everybody spent a lot of time on it.
well, and it may be a starting point for, even as you guys are looking at providing feedback, that approach, feedback when you see all these pieces together. So we're doing what we can to align and coordinate. We are in the first draft, definitely going to miss things. It's not going to be perfect, but yeah, any kind of feedback that we can get and make adjustments and align things better and deal with the implications of multiple different standards. We'll be looking forward to hearing back from everyone. And implications, positive or negative. So I think different folks will have different perspectives on it, and we're anticipating going ahead and doing some of the things that I think we did back then, is looking at things from a fiscal perspective, well, not a fiscal perspective, but a financial perspective, and some assessment along those lines as well. And I'm saying that as we're talking about stormwater, but it's not, that's not related to stormwater so much as looking across the board. So when we put all these things together, how are they working together? Are they getting us the kind of community we want? Are they feasible? So on and so forth.
yeah, it was when Ed was leading the committee before the comp plan and TOD efforts started, is when we went through that effort, Laura.
So you're not talking about the ordinance changes that were made
No,
2009, 2010.
no, he's talking about when we kicked off this committee in 2016. I'm looking back through all my emails. Some of the original efforts with the UDO advisory committee were that was a conflict matrix between the ordinances.
Okay, we can look for that. Yes, I'm hoping we've hit a lot of those.
Yeah, it'd be a great, I think your idea of it being a checklist, because it was basically, you can't have a tree where you have a sidewalk and a bike lane, or where there's a sight triangle. And right now there's just a lot of things like that, just from a technical basis, that don't work. So if we didn't iron out those technical aspects after spending all the time on it, and we still had to deal with that, it would be, I think, a failure of the process. So yeah, using it as a checklist, and like you say, hopefully 90% of it's done and 10% of it doesn't apply anymore because the ordinances have come together. But great, I'll try to find that as well.
Yeah.
Thanks for clarifying, Nate.
We put something out there and you guys go, hey, these things are conflicting. You know, anyone on the OAC is like, how do you do this if you also are trying to do this? I will say one thing, just kind of a shout out to Jordan and Andrew and those folks, is one of those areas, and I'm not going to probably have the right terminology, but is that natural area requirement that has been in post-construction, and someone can correct me, and trees, and how do we need both of those? And I think you saw that, and asked Jordan to jump in, but the recommendation is that no, we don't. that they're both accomplishing the same thing. So where do we have one standard instead of multiple standards that are really trying to accomplish the same thing?
Yeah, good point.
Okay. Just a comment there. I think it's a follow-up for Eric on the sort of green stormwater infrastructure that we were talking about earlier. So we won't see them here anytime soon. I don't know if that's what you were saying.
Yeah, I think that's what
In
he's
the
saying.
right of way.
In the right of way.
In the right of way specifically. Yeah.
Soon's relative.
Unless it's done by the city.
Right. Yeah. I would say that it's possible. I mean, a lot of it can be driven by the market outside of the right of way. You know, does it make more sense for a site to do it regionally or not? You know, and folks like Nate could speak to that. But in the right of way, we have been. I mean, it's safe to say that we have been exploring that as options for compliance for our own projects. You know, sometimes you hit things in the way. There's utilities. There's all kinds of things that can get in the way of that, because a lot of our projects are in existing right of way where we already have a lot of existing infrastructure. So I don't have a great answer to it. I think they're totally in the toolbox, and we've been discussing this with our transportation folks and design folks for many years now. So potentially, but it's I'm in the compliance world, so I don't push the mechanisms that are utilized for compliance to keep myself out of trouble.
Right. Yeah, it's just, I guess my overall point is just like what we did with the tree ordinance and updating that for urban districts is just suggesting, you know, that stormwater bioretention for urban areas. Like, you know, I think it's the Duke Foundation on East Moorhead Street. They have half of the lot in the back is retention, and it's urban area and basically kind of useless. You can't really use it as a park. There's not even trees planted in the center of it, trees around it, but it's just unutilized space in an urban area, you know. And I know it adds some green space, but as far as, you know, being amenitized or being useful and maximizing as much space in the little space we have in the urban areas and neighborhoods and centers, that just figuring out some innovative ways that other cities have done that bioretention and stormwater, rainwater collection, and just, you know, maximize the efficiency on it, and just kind of getting that implemented in certain locations and more urban areas.
Yep. No, I hear you. And I will say that, you know, we've talked to, we're involved in some organizations that span the continent, and talked to a lot of the folks that have a lot of these assets, like Portland, who's got over 2,000 in the right of way. And they have a lot of different drivers too. They're very volume driven because they're a combined system. So they just need to get rainwater out of their system because they're sending it to a treatment plant. DC is much the same way. They have both split and combined system in DC. But no, your points are all well taken here. And in fact, one of the dry detention pond on this section outline slide is the Duke Endowment on Moorhead. Ironically enough, it's one of the better dry detention basins aesthetically in the city out of about maybe 1,500 of them. So ironically enough, but no, I hear your point. And I did want to point out that I didn't delve into this, but since the redevelopment thing came up, I did want to point out that does not apply to public entities. So property owned by the city of Charlotte, CMS, UNCC, any public entity would still need to provide stormwater control measures for redevelopment. So like if we tear up a street and rebuild it, we still need to do, stormwater controls on that site. So that is one sort of knife edge that I wasn't going to mention, but since it did come up, I thought I'd mention that.
Great. Next one came from Nate. Please confirm that the 1978 detention requirements go away with the new zoning ordinance update.
Yes. With the lower thresholds, the goal is to capture anything we would have missed with the old post-construction rules that, you know, that Nate, you've always had to say, oh yeah, we made it through this flow chart for post-construction. What about zoning detention? The goal is to make that go away and just have it be one more comprehensive stormwater management chapter.
Okay. Matt Langston had the next question. Just the comment that we need to make sure that there's effective language for flexibility for site compliance. By lowering the thresholds, what was once a nominal redevelopment project may become a much more complicated answer, especially because Charlotte has many areas where existing infrastructure relies on sheet flow, so underground storm piping isn't available nearby.
Yeah, and I know I touched a little bit of that to Nate's question about lowering the threshold, potentially having more smaller sites comply. And that relates more to sort of the BMP manual update thing of, where there's not existing infrastructure. And we run into that now, and I know y'all deal with it all the time, where sand filter pushes a system down and the system in the street has got a foot of cover. So yeah, that's a known area where we need to make sure that we're not making things impossible to comply with, for sure. But I don't have a good answer for you, but appreciate the concern, and it's shared.
Great. And then the last one that I see, and we'll allow this to jump in if I missed anybody, but it's from Nate. The question is, is there any thought as part of the UDO that some aspects of stormwater, tree ordinance, subdivision have exceptions for community goals such as affordable housing? That's probably a broader question. I don't know, Jordan, if you want to take that, or Laura or Alan. I mean, feel free to jump in.
I guess I'll jump in. So we've struggled with this, and let me to mention it, say, from a tree perspective. So if we think that that trees are an important part, and the trees that are coming from the tree ordinance are an important part of the quality of a neighborhood or a development. So my question is, I struggle with this because it would be easy to do that, but are we then ending up with affordable housing of a lesser quality than other development? So I kind of put that out there to the group, and that's kind of an easy one. Subdivision, a little tougher, and I know probably as you're talking about subdivision, I'm assuming Nate, you're talking about streets and street requirements.
Yeah, whether we like it or not, everything that's part of a development costs money.
Right.
And it trickles down to whoever is occupying that as the end user. So, would somebody rather pay less rent than having 10 less trees on their site? I don't know. I guess the question I've always asked is, the city has all of these goals. It's hard to prioritize them all at the same level. If some are a higher goal than others, how do we accomplish that in innovative ways?
I think that is a good point. To me, part of it is, I've always struggled when we've seen developments. It's not a very large site, but large enough that it's for affordable, and it is triggering a street. And we know the infrastructure cost of that. So, is it only by relaxing the regulations, or is there, should there be funding from the city and we don't have the housing folks on here, so I don't want to speak for them, but to help with some of those infrastructure costs if you're going beyond kind of a certain base cost.
Or the payment in lieu options less, or your water sewer capacity fees are reduced. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to attack it. Diminishing.
Yeah, and some of it may be through UDO and some of it may not be. I mean, I think it's a very valid question. I'd be interested to know if there are other people on here that would suggest, because maybe that's where the group ends up with a recommendation of relaxing requirements for in exchange for affordable housing.
I'll say real quick, and Daryl touched on this. I see Eric, you have your hand up, Andrew, just FYI, in case you didn't see it. So from a stormwater perspective, and I hear Nate's mostly sounds like referring to maybe some other realms, but from a stormwater perspective, as Daryl stated, just because there is affordable housing there, we don't want someone to be straddled with a flooding issue or a water quality issue because it happens to be affordable housing site, or to saddle someone downstream of them with a flooding issue because they were not required to do something on their site. So we've been looking at it from that lens and more of like an environmental justice realm. But so that's my 2 cents on that. To your point about the mitigation fee, and that was sort of the idea, and I know you were involved more so than I back in the original adoption process, but with the whole business corridor revitalization area, and that was the whole idea. It was to incentivize that redevelopment without having the assets on site. So I don't know. That's my 2 cents to expound on what Daryl said.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And I'll let Eric, if you have your comment, you feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point, and I just try to get it in the chat, but you just got to be careful with what we relax. I don't think sacrificing quality of life, health, whatever it may be, with certain requirements like trees, especially, or other infrastructure, to gain affordable housing, especially if those affordable housing end up being concentrated, because then we're just going to end up with inequities again and continue the inequities that currently exist with some affordable housing locations having no trees or very little trees and become heat islands and so on and so forth, or higher concentrations of pollutions or whatever it is. There's 1,000 different things. And I think we have to be careful with what we are trying to streamline or incentivize with certain parts of the regulation. But some things that might speed up with fees behind the scenes that don't impact people's quality of life, I think those should be on the table. But we just got to be careful with what we are axing out.
Absolutely. Okay, let's see. I just see one comment here from John. Totally agree that impairing the environment for the benefit of affordable housing is not what the UDO should do. However, providing a 5 versus an 8-foot sidewalk, tax abatements, permit fee reductions, exempt permits. Yeah. Well, I think a lot of these things are things that we're considering and looking at. And I don't know if we have a full built out answer for you guys today, but certainly something we're considering. It's kind of the question of the time, right? It's the question that a lot of cities are dealing with. And so Charlotte is no exemption to that. I don't know. I see Laura, you're unmuted. Do you have anything else to add to that before I think we'll probably move. Well, okay, I see another one here. Okay, this is a comment from Ishmael. Perhaps this issue requires coordination with other city departments to make funding available to cover stormwater requirements for large and medium scale affordable housing developments. This could even fall into the realm of community benefits for publicly funded or subsidized projects. Yeah, certainly. Community benefits are one part of the comprehensive plan that is a highly talked about component right now, and something we're thinking through as a staff. I will share that we're, in a lot of talks about where we go and how we implement these sorts of things. So lots of questions right now, but there's a lot of support for stuff like this. So all that's to say, I think we'll continue this conversation and try and work these things out as we get closer to a public draft. Anything else from Laura on that?
Now, only that I think the regulatory side of it, the actual regulations are but one piece of it. And so it's kind of a lot of different aspects of that. So there's that, but there's the who pays for it, or there, so it's a really interesting topic, and I think very valid. So I appreciate that everyone has jumped in.
Laura, can I ask a question?
Sure, Walter.
I'm sorry, I couldn't find the raise your hand button, so I thought I'd just use my actual hand. This last several minutes of discussion is quite interesting and also quite revealing from the days when early on when we did produce that matrix, and one of the primary reasons was to try to figure out where the conflicts and things were, to even more recent discussion about the comp plan, where some of the comments have dealt with the lack of a prioritization process, when in fact there are perfectly good, valid, and reasonable goals stated in the comp plan, taken one at a time. But when you start mixing them all together, you run into these very same conflicts that this committee is talking about right now. So perhaps that could be some feedback or a message going back across the hall to the comprehensive planning part of the process that's going on, because this discussion is exactly what has been brought up, is that there's not a mechanism to resolve the conflicts and differences and so forth. So just for what it's worth, thank you.
That's helpful, Walter. And we're hearing this. It would be really helpful to us to be able to test even some of what we're looking at with the regulations for those who are involved on the design and development end of where have you hit conflicts? Because you're going to probably know them even better than we are. Because
some are very simple. I mean, some are ones that have been mentioned on this call today about the desire to have wider, more pedestrian amenities and bike amenities as part of the regular development process, all of which are excellent goals. And then other goals which talk about zero loss of tree canopy. Well, if you start putting bike lanes on the street and then you widen the sidewalk on both sides, you've made the entire area to be graded, 20 or 25 feet wider. And now you've got a conflict with trying to not take down any trees. That's a simple one. But I think there are more complex ones when we get more into the depth of the real technical site design work that people have to do to comply with the ordinance that we're creating based on these policies in the plan. We're almost setting ourselves up for failure. And it seemed like this might be an opportunity to provide just that collective feedback back to the other process.
And I think they've heard that. I think they're largely counting on the UDO to resolve that, for better or worse.
How's that working out?
But I think if there are very specific development examples that folks want to shoot us, that would be incredibly valuable, because we think we're trying to do this, but we know we're going to miss some things. And the more of that you can provide of like, hey, on this site, we had this problem and we couldn't make these things work together, that would be valuable. So if anyone, that works in that end of things wants to do that.
Yes, I hope they're all listening.
I see Eric's hand is up again. Is that a holdover hand or same one? Okay.
Nope. It's to address Walter's comment there. I think, his specific example with sidewalks, bike lanes, and trees, right? And I think we've dealt with this when we talked about, or at least I know I have with Sustain Charlotte. We got a lot of pushback from the folks who support trees no matter what. And we were at the table or in that rewrite to make, more flexibility in urban areas, right? We understand that you can't take that approach, blanket it across every single parcel across the city and expect it to work. That's not what we're talking about. I think when you look at the place types and that gets translated into districts, that tree, sidewalk, bike infrastructure is going to change depending on what district it is zoned, right? I think that's the idea of anybody familiar with form-based code, that transect, that transition, the trees and where they're located will look different as you approach the center city, right? And I think that's hopefully what you guys are doing with the plan and working that in there, where it may look like a conflict when you look from it 50,000 feet and think, well, how is this all going to work? But you got to really look at it as a systematic approach with that transition. So trees are allowed everywhere, but they're going to look different depending on where you're located at and what is zoned. And hopefully, that gets to what you're talking about, Walter, and achieves the goals. Now, if you look only at one thing or one neighborhood or one place type, you're not going to reach the 50% canopy goal, if you're looking at it with your blinders on. You have to take it as a sum of all the parts, and hopefully, that will come together to get closer to those goals that we're trying to do. And they're not really conflicts. It's just the perception or the level you're looking at it. And if you don't look at it in context, then it looks like a conflict. I hope that makes sense. And hopefully that is what we're trying to achieve here. And if not, that's what we need to do.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we're trying to achieve. And that was the point that I was trying to make, is that as it stands, and there may be any number of changes in the comp plan draft, what you just said is not clear. The place types, there's very little discussion about those, and mapping and all that will come later. All I'm suggesting is that this conversation we're having right here will come up later after the comp plan is adopted, and people will point at different sections in the comp plan and say, no, our side wins because we're better, and no, our side wins because we have more equitable mobility. No, our side wins because we have tree shaded sidewalks. All three of those statements are in the comp plan, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but the guidance about how to create that balance. The question a while ago about do you change things to incentivize affordable housing? I think that's a great question, and I think that's another example of where the comp plan sets these a lot of really good goals if you take one at a time. But since we don't have that big picture, Eric, that some of us has been suggesting should be part of the comp plan, we have to assume that what people write is what they mean, and we read that and we read the next one and we see a problem. This conversation, I think, illustrates that.
Yeah, and this is certainly an important conversation, and we're not going to discount that. I do want to make sure that we have time to get to the drainage article. Because that's another biggie. But I think Eric's point and Walter's point are both well taken, that we got to think through this and do our due diligence now, because once these are implemented, there's going to be unintended consequences, and we certainly are prepared for that and ready and are thinking through that every day. So I thank everybody for their comments on that.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to have to go to another meeting, but thank you so much.
Oh, you're going to miss the best part, but no.
Well, I'll catch the rerun when after it's indicated. I'll catch it on the rerun.
That's right. It's live stream, so you can go to YouTube now and watch it as you go on your other meeting. But anyway, thank you.
All right, thanks. I appreciate it.
Yep. And we will hand it off to Kate Labadorf to talk about our stormwater drainage regulations.
Thank you, Andrew. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide. The city currently reviews and inspects subdivisions, commercial projects, multifamily for drainage. But we're seeing more and more development that doesn't trigger a drainage review or construction inspection. We're seeing infill, redevelopment, smaller exempt minor subdivisions and stuff. Next slide. And as infill development increases, we're finding more development-related drainage issues, and stormwater is receiving more development-related calls requesting service. And just over the past 2 years, we've received over 200 development-related calls. And so these bullets are just kind of a grouping of the issues that we're seeing. We're seeing modifications to the city drainage system, either systems being removed or modified. When not done correctly, this can damage or create problems with the city's drainage system. And stormwater then either has to go after the developer or the property owner, or has to spend monies and resources to correct the issue. New homes, buildings, additions, pools are being built within city or public drainage easements, and sometimes the structures are even built on top of the drainage system. This makes maintaining the drainage system a nightmare. And if an issue develops with the drainage system, it can cause structural and or foundation issues for the home. Installing inadequate systems or using poor construction methods, this can cause flooding and or create maintenance issues that the new homeowner or adjacent property owner has to deal with and attempt to address. Residential driveway locations can conflict with existing drainage systems, which usually leads the developer to either remove or modify or damage the city's drainage system. Often the driveway apron isn't constructed with enough slope up from the roadway, And this allows stormwater runoff from the street to flow down the driveway. In most cases, this just results in nuisance flooding, but in some cases it can lead to garage or living space flooding. Building structures that flood, many of the remaining vacant lots have not been developed because of drainage and our flooding concerns. And new homes are being built that flood. And flooding is not limited to FEMA regulated streams. It can really happen anywhere. So another point is that developing properties in a way that creates flooding for adjacent properties, drainage flows downhill. If a development adds fill to their lot, fills in a ditch, elevates an inlet, or other modification, they can create flooding on the adjacent property. And lastly, developing where there's known drainage issues. And so there are existing drainage problems throughout the city. And as development becomes more intense, there's less land and less options to improve and maintain the drainage system. So I'd like to share 4 examples with you that illustrate some of these drainage concerns. This first example, 3 single homes were demolished and 3 duplexes were built. The upper photo shows the 3 homes that were torn down. The lower photo shows the duplexes that were built. To the left in the upper photo where that fence is, that is a storm channel with a gabion wall. And when the developer graded the lots, he excavated for basements and he also added fill in places. Stormwater Services had previously improved the channel along that fence line adjacent to the property and built a gabion wall, which is a rock wall structure along the channel bank. As part of that project, the previous homeowner granted the city a drainage easement to maintain the channel and the gabion wall. And the developer added gabion baskets. So when he added the fill, he actually added gabion baskets on top of the city's gabion wall in order to add the fill to the lot that you see kind of past the white car, that kind of reddish area is filled up. We don't know if this addition, this gabion wall addition, was structurally engineered or if it's structurally stable. Also, the developer didn't follow the residential driveway standards, sloping the driveway apron up from the roadway before sloping it down. You can see on that bottom picture that there's little to no curbing or elevation to keep the water in the street. So when it rains, since this is almost at the bottom of the hill, water comes down the road and actually goes down that driveway and into the garages. And there's finished floor behind those garages. So we found out about this development when the new property owner called complaining about living space flooding, expecting us to solve their drainage problem. Next example. So this is a single family home that was torn down and a larger home built. The upper left photo shows the house that was torn down. It's the middle, so second in from the left. And the upper right shows the new larger home with the driveway that goes down and comes around the back. The garage is actually off you enter it in the back side of the property. So Stormwater Services previously improved this drainage system. You can see the red line on both maps. That's the drainage system. And the previous property owner granted us an easement to maintain the system. When the developer built the new home, he added fill to the site, and this required that he raise the inlet in the back. In the lower photo to the left, it's kind of hard to see, but there is a brown structure close to the vegetation just past the corner of the house. That is a yard inlet. He raised this inlet using substandard materials and methods for construction. In raising the inlet, he caused an issue for the adjacent property. So on the lower right, that property is the next door neighbor with the wood privacy fence. And if you look at where the mud is collecting, that's where that property is supposed to drain into the inlet. But when the developer raised it, it can no longer drain into that inlet. So we learned about this development when the adjacent property owner called to complain about the flooding and the muddy mess in his backyard. Third example, single family home torn down and rebuilt with a larger home. The new home was built within a city storm drainage easement. The back porch is actually over the 24-inch concrete pipe. This is a drainage system that stormwater constructed as part of a capital project, and maintenance is now very difficult with limited options, and it's potentially much more expensive to maintain the pipe. If the pipe deteriorates and fails, the house is at much greater risk of being damaged than if the house were further away from the drainage pipe. And you can see in the photo, we've approximated where that pipe is with the white shading, and you can see how it's going under the back corner of the house. We learned about this development when a stormwater inspector who was familiar with the capital project drove by and noticed the new home. Fourth example, this is a new subdivision along an existing street. So the developer took 30 lots and divided it into about 70, give or take a few, for single family and multifamily homes. The upper photos show what this street looked like when it was 30 single family homes. The bottom photos show what it looks like now. The additional lots in the building result in many more driveways. And so if you look at that lower left or right photo, you can see that it's driveway after driveway after driveway with some small grass strips in between. The upper left photo shows an elongated throat inlet, which is used to capture lots of drainage. It was installed as part of a capital project by Stormwater Services back in the early 2000s. That elongated throat catches a lot more water than a single catch basin or even a double catch basin. The lower left photo shows the driveway that was built at that same location of the elongated throat. So the builder gets ready to pour the driveway and realizes the conflict. And so he removes the elongated throat inlet and puts in two non-standard inlets at the driveway. So these two inlets don't capture near the water that the elongated throat used to capture. We found out about this site when the construction inspector was out looking at what was going on. But by then the house is built, there's little room to work with, and our options are limited on how to resolve the conflict. Last example. This is 3 lots, and they were vacant. The developer subdivided one of the lots. So in all, he had 4 lots, and he built 4 single-family homes. The upper left photo is the before picture. And what you see is an existing red brick home. And then to the right is the beginnings of the first vacant lot. The upper, there was a stream running through the vacant lots. And the developer had to pipe in the stream, and he added significant fill to the lots. The lower left photo is the same red brick house, but this is from the backyard. So you're looking at the red brick house, and you're looking, the whitish colored house next to it is one of the new 4 homes. The white house is actually downstream of the red brick home. The water is supposed to go to your left when you look at the screen. So what the developer did was he installed an 18-inch plastic pipe. You look at the upper right photo, that's the pipe that was installed. And it heads out where we think that pipe is actually under the 4th new home. It goes at a diagonal through those lots. And we're pretty sure it's under the 4th new home. And then if you look at the bottom picture on the right, that is a picture inside the new pipe showing you the condition. So there's already an issue with the pipe system due to poor construction methods. So I could continue. And we found out about that one when the property owner in the red brick home called because he had 3 feet deep water in his living space. So I could continue for hours, maybe even days, with examples of drainage issues resulting from the smaller infill development. But instead, I'm going to transition to what we want to do moving forward to try to minimize future drainage issues as a result of development. So looking at our current ordinances, development-related drainage requirements are scattered all over the place. Jordan kind of had that slide up before showing all the different ordinances that stormwater hits. But they're almost exclusively related to larger developments. And as part of the UDO, we're trying to consolidate these requirements into a section dedicated to drainage. And these are the section outline. I can't talk. The section outline. The first is the purpose, primarily to protect public health and safety. Then there's applicability, And we are expanding applicability from the larger developments to include smaller infill development, including new buildings, additions, swimming pools, including new or modified drainage systems that are either in the city's right-of-way, a drainage easement, or drainage systems that include runoff from a public street. And then also including where they're grading or doing fill activities and changing surface water patterns. For storm drainage standards, we've grouped that into 4 different sections. And I'm going to talk about those sections in just a minute. And then the end of the drainage section outlines kind of the appeal and variance process, and then violations and enforcement. So next slide, this is getting into the actual storm drainage standards. So currently, encroachments. Currently, the City of Charlotte storm drainage easements do prohibit structures from encroaching within the easement limits. And there are ordinances out there that say you can't obstruct the city drainage system. However, developers aren't always aware of the easement or the drainage system. And we're not aware, stormwater is often not aware, as those examples show, until after development occurs. And then it becomes a much more expensive issue to resolve. So what we're proposing is to limit how close new structures can be built to storm drainage systems, to identify and limit driveway conflicts with existing drainage, to ensure that connections to the city drainage system are constructed in accordance with Charlotte land development standards. So the next one is stormwater runoff and conveyance. For subdivisions, commercial development, and development adding more than 20,000 square feet, subdivisions, developers have to submit a drainage plan with their subdivision plans or their commercial plans, and they have to meet the Charlotte land development standards and stormwater design manual. What we're proposing is that regardless of the size of the development, if it is installing new or modifying existing drainage, and that drainage conveys runoff from a public street, then the drainage, the design and the installation of the drainage must meet the Charlotte land development standards and the stormwater design manual. Then lots subject to flooding. So currently in the subdivision ordinance, lots subject to flooding have to have a flood study done and identify the stormwater protection elevation line. What we're proposing is that regardless of the type of the development, if you're developing a lot that's subject to flooding, then a stormwater protection line should be determined, shown on the, and buildings built above this elevation so that we're not building new buildings that flood. And the last one, storm drainage easements. So currently subdivisions plat storm drainage easements for the land development standards. This is land that is set aside to allow and provide for the area to drain and for that drainage to be maintained. What we're proposing is that regardless of the type of development, if the lot conveys runoff from a public street, a drainage easement, as defined in the land development standards, should be set aside to allow and provide for the area to drain and to be able to maintain that drainage. So what we're wanting to do is to have a drainage plan and permit. To require that similar, like today, let me back up a second. Today, subdivisions have to turn in plans, they're reviewed, they're looked at, the drainage is looked at. Commercial, multifamily typically have to turn in plans, they're reviewed and they're looked at. We have inspectors in the field that review and approve the construction. We're not proposing changes to that. We're just proposing a similar process for the smaller lots. So a drainage submittal, review and approval, and inspection for building permits, adding drainage submittal, review and approval and inspection for connecting to the city drainage system, installing or modifying drainage that conveys water from a public street, or land disturbing activities like grading that modifies existing surface drainage. So in some cases that will be outside the typical subdivision, commercial, multifamily, or even the building permit process. But in most cases, the building permit process would be where this is added. The plan submittal requirements will depend upon site conditions and the planned activities. So in some cases, it may be as simple as a sketch showing where the new footprint of the building is going to be. In other cases, it may require engineer drawings. It all just depends on what's going on the site. From a staffing standpoint, it will require additional city staff. And it will require that we insert ourselves into the county building permit process. And that also that we create a process for those that don't require building permits. So to close, I want to kind of show you how those sites that I showed you before might be different if we had a drainage plan and permit process in place now. This one is the example 3 from earlier. If we had a storm drainage plan as part of the building permit process, we would have identified the storm drainage easement and the existing pipe system at that point, and the proposed building location footprint could have been modified before ever digging the first shovel of dirt. This next one is example 1 from earlier. If there was a storm drainage permit required when you're installing or modifying the drainage system, we would have been part of the process to review and approve the modifications to the gabion baskets before they were constructed and the fill added and the structures built. And then this next one is example 4 from earlier. A storm drainage plan as part of the building permit process to install a driveway within 10 feet of a storm drainage would have identified this conflict of the elongated throat inlet with the proposed driveway prior to building the home, and the location of the garage could have been modified and the conflict resolved before the home was built. And lastly, this was example 5 from earlier. If a storm drainage permit prior to grading the lots was required, we would have been able to work with the developer to redesign the proposed 4 lots and avoid flooding the upstream home. That is what I have. Questions and comments?
Thank you, Kate. I see 2 questions from Nate. The first one, and I think you covered this, but does this indicate that a homeowner will need to hire a PE to create a land development submittal?
In some cases,
but
not all cases. And we're working on a checklist, starting with the existing land development checklist for subdivisions and commercials to see what would be different and try to have a very standard process that a homeowner can go through and go, okay, this is what I'm wanting to do. Here's what I will need to do. And do I need to hire an engineer or not?
And then the next one from Nate is, does the 7.5 foot additional no build zone in the easement or along the easement also translate to commercial projects?
Yeah, and the 7.5 feet is just trying for areas that there's not existing easements. What we took was the existing land development easement widths, and the smallest one is 15 feet, and it cut it in half. And it said, hey, you know what? For where we need to at least be 7.5 feet away from the drainage in order for there to be any hopes to maintain the system and to convey
so
the
that's
water like it's meant to be.
That's for existing systems with
easement. With no easement.
Okay. Yeah, I know, again, I think everything made sense. I mean, a lot of these issues are the city has storm drainage going out of street through thousands of properties throughout the city, and it creates a lot of issues for you all, and you don't have the maintenance resources to fix them all. So one follow-up question would be, how, if it takes you 5 years to get out there and fix a sinkhole in their yard and they're doing their own fixes, how are you all looking at those situations? Because I know your maintenance backlog is very, very long.
The maintenance backlog is very long, and it has led us to change how we respond to citizen requests. And a lot, when the pipe leaves the right of way, unless we have a city storm drainage easement on that pipe, it is the private citizens And so new sinkholes that are getting called in, we are guiding the citizen on how he might can correct that sinkhole, but we are not necessarily adding them to a list to be fixed, and it is falling on the private property owner. And that's one of the things that really motivates me to try to get better things in the ground to start with, because these maintenance responsibilities are hitting homeowners associations, individual property owners, commercial property owners, and it's difficult.
Great. Question from Matt Langston. If there's a condition where the public street water is draining through private property and potentially creating problems, what will be the obligation of the property owner? Don't make the problem worse or fix an existing problem. Seems like a potential missed opportunity for the city to improve the existing condition while the work is being done. Shouldn't necessarily be borne by the property owner.
Yeah, and for this drainage plan and permit process, what we've tried to do is say, hey, you know, if you have an existing system on your property and you're not changing it, you're not modifying it, you're not making anything that's going to require that you change it, then you can leave it as is, just build far enough away from it. And we will be at the table early enough to where if we know there's an issue there, we can potentially step in and say, hey, this system needs to be, especially if it needs to be larger, this system needs to be larger to protect the street from flooding or something. We've had some cases like that where we've missed opportunities because we didn't know the development was occurring. And what was a ditch on a vacant lot is now an undersized pipe between two houses that are both 5 feet from the pipe. And the options now are very limited on what can be done to address the street flooding. So we are trying to catch those earlier by knowing about the developments earlier. But if someone is like that fifth example where the developer to develop the lots is piping in a channel, there's 20 acres of drainage coming to those sites. And if he wants to pipe in that channel to develop those lots, the expectation is that he would put in the right size and he would do it in such a way that he's not flooding his upstream property adjacent neighbor, but conveying the water in a responsible manner according to the land development and stormwater design manual.
Awesome. Any other follow-up from others? I don't see any other questions. Kate, I think you did a great job presenting that. I like the use of pictures and everything. So hopefully that was easy for folks to understand. Any other, I'll pause just one more time for any other questions or comments before we move on. And even if it's not a question, just a comment, we'd be glad to talk through anything today while we're on the call. Okay. Hearing nothing else, I will say if there is a desire from anyone else to connect offline, talk about some of these things, we're always available to have conversations like that. So please reach out to Laura, Alan, or myself, and we'd be happy to facilitate those conversations. But just please reach out. Who do you want me to take this next one, Laura, or do you got it?
Get away, Andrew.
All right. So next steps, we will be working on a follow-up survey with questions on each of these articles as a review is post-construction and drainage. We'll send that out probably midweek next week. We'd like to touch base with our stormwater folks before we send that out. And then May 13th will be our next meeting where we will talk about trees. A lot of discussion about trees today. We will carry that over to our next meeting on May 13th. And then May 27th and June 10th is when we will kick off the subdivision streets and infrastructure section of the UDO. And with that, we just want to say thank you for your time today. And again, connect if you have any other questions or comments offline, but thanks for being here, everybody. Do we have, is anybody going to close this?
I think you're doing it. Thank you guys again. Really good conversation today. We appreciate it. And we obviously have some follow-up work to do. Have a good couple of weeks and we'll see you 2 weeks from today.